What's poppin' and welcome back to Maxify Film Review, where today I'm excited to have for the first time a Maxify Film Review double feature. Meaning today I'm going to be reviewing not one, but two movies. Venom from 2018 and Venom Let There Be Carnage from 2 weeks ago in 2021. So I actually saw Venom 2 on opening night with my brother, who you know as the co-host of Maxify Seminar. And the intention was we were going to see the movie that night and then the next day get out a nice early Maxify Seminar video breaking down our review of the film. And that obviously did not happen. I came out of that movie with like 4 pages of notes. We both came out of it very confused, very bewildered, I think. And we're going to get into that later when I talk about the movie. But in any case, I ended up seeing it again after rewatching Venom 1, and so I think I'm finally ready to give a general consensus of what I think of this film. So starting with Venom 1, which came out in 2018, this film was directed by Ruben Fleischer and follows Tom Hardy's Eddie Brock as he is intertwined with the alien symbiote Venom. And at the point of the film taking place, Eddie Brock is very down on his luck. Very much at the end of his rope, and this is definitely not helped by the kind of intrusion of Venom into his life. And so when this movie originally came out in 2018, I remember I was so excited watching the trailer for the first time and seeing this movie get announced for the first time was so exciting because it was at a point where Marvel was peaking. Superhero movies were peaking with Infinity War and with Endgame and the culmination of the MCU, and it was a very exciting time. But then Venom seemed to be this kind of darker take on the superhero movie, and I was really excited about that. And this movie in its final form is not that. And that is my biggest critique of Venom, is it had so much potential and it just didn't do a lot with it. It starts very much like how I wanted it to. It started with a lot of potential. It started with this very dark, mysterious, almost horror-esque vibe for the first act of the movie. And I was really kind of on the edge of my seat. I was waiting to see what was going to happen with this and where this was going to go. And then there was, I think, a 6-month time jump. And this is really where the movie started to lose me, because this movie has 2 first acts, and that is one of its biggest problems, for sure. And so by this I mean the film sets itself up twice. You get an entire establishment of the world of the story, of the character of Eddie Brock, and everything he's all about. Then you get a 6-month time jump to where he is a totally different person, living in a totally different world. And so the first 20 minutes of the movie are pretty much more or less pointless, because at the point where the movie actually takes place, none of that stuff is really going to matter. And I think this is a classic example of when it's better to tell rather than to show, because if some of the stuff that was introduced to us in that first act was just told to us through maybe exposition in what eventually becomes the first act of this movie, we wouldn't have had to deal with 20 minutes of setup that goes into nothing and goes into 20 minutes of setup for the rest of the movie. But the result of this is the movie feeling very overlong because you have so much setup. Almost half the movie is setup because you have an initial setup and then you have this second setup. And so there's also a lot of tonal slippage there because the tone from the first part slips when you have a whole new tone set up in the first act. And I'll get more into the tone of this movie in a second, but the fact that this movie has that extra 20 minutes of opening really does a lot to slow the pacing, because not only do you have to sit through two entire establishments of this world. By the time you get to the end, everything starts to feel rushed because you had so much setup, and then there's no way almost the same amount of time worth of actual action can really balance that out. So on the topic of the tone of the movie, this is maybe one of my biggest critiques of the movie, is that it is inconsistent in its tone. Because for the first half, well, okay, this movie starts very much how I wanted this movie to be when I saw it in 2018, when I was excited to see a dark and gritty, almost horror reimagining of a superhero film. And it has a lot of promise in that genre as the movie gets going and as we get through the first, I don't know, maybe like 30 minutes of the film. But then as you get into the second act, and especially towards the end of the second act, this becomes very typical. It becomes very much a bathos humor, CGI thrills type, almost MCU-esque movie, but just with none of the charm. And so the result is kind of just a subpar superhero movie that's just masquerading as something more provocative, something more innovative. And this is reflected in the cinematography as well, because you get this dark and gritty cinematography, but you also have these weird, like, Star Trek lens flares all over the place. And so I guess that's a good example of cinematography reflecting one of the tone of the movie, because it's also inconsistent. But there's so much missed opportunity in this movie because it does have good parts, and in those good parts you can tell, God, this could have been so good. A great example is the lobster scene. The lobster scene is brilliant. This is how you should integrate comedy into a dark superhero movie. This is great. And there's so much potential there for like an exploration of the psyche of this character, and like the idea of the horror of midlife crisis, and like how midlife crisis can maybe be reflected in this story of an alien latching itself onto a journalist. And there's so much potential there, but it never really does anything with it. Instead, it turns into basically a standard superhero movie, a movie that doesn't really explore any of it. And so I felt empty watching the end of this film, and it's really a shame that they couldn't do more with what they had. And the villain too, Riz Ahmed as the villain of this movie, it's a great performance to start, and it's very Nightcrawler-esque, Jake Gyllenhaal in Nightcrawler, but then it ends up as he's just kind of used as a puppet, and then you don't get much with that. I think the potential for an Elon Musk type villain, like a Tony Stark but bad, has a lot of potential, just like a lot of this movie, and it doesn't live up to it. I don't know if this was maybe the result of studio interference, or what it seems like a lot to me is a struggle to meet PG-13. But it really is a shame that this movie slipped away from what it seemed like it could have been, and it had so much potential, but it kind of blew it. But it wasn't all bad. I really did enjoy a lot of this film. I really enjoyed Tom Hardy's performance as both Eddie Brock and as Venom, and the interplay between them was incredible and hilarious at parts. The lobster scene I already mentioned was brilliant, and I really enjoyed a lot of what he did with this character, and he really did carry the movie. Overall, I'm going to give Venom 1 a 5.5 out of 10. Now that seems harsh, I'm sure, but it had so much potential to be such a cool exploration, and you see that in the movie. You see how much potential it had, and it ends up as this it's just kind of a mess. It's a total mess. It's a structural mess. It's a tonal mess. Anyways, now getting on to Venom, Let There Be Carnage, Venom 2 This time was directed by Andy Serkis, and this time stars Woody Harrelson opposite Tom Hardy's Venom as Carnage, who is kind of the center point of this film. Cletus Cassidy, the man inside of Carnage, is this twisted serial killer guy, and this whole movie is about his kind of final ballet, if you will. And Naomie Harris's character gets involved. She is heavily involved with Harrelson's character's backstory, and so you get this very dually structured movie where you're following not only what Eddie Brock and Venom are doing, but what Cletus Cassidy and Carnage and Naomie Harris's character Shriek are doing, and it all culminates in the end in a massive CGI battle, of course. Going into this movie, I recalled a lot of my thoughts on Venom 1, on the tonal inconsistencies, on the overlongness, and I was like, come on, hopefully they can get it together this time. The runtime is 90 minutes, hopefully that'll help with the pacing. Andy Serkis is directing, hopefully he can stick tighter to that dark tone that I really wanted to see, and definitely does not stick to a dark tone. This movie, if anything, it goes the complete opposite direction. This movie embraces cheesiness and camp in every single way. But at least it sticks to a tone. There's no more tonal struggle in this. There's no more weird dynamic between horror and comedy that doesn't mix. This movie is a full-on goofball comedy. And a lot of people, I think, were taken aback with this and were maybe surprised with this after the marketing of the first one and the general consensus of the first one, as well as the marketing of the second one, honestly. But I thought this was a major plus because at least now we don't have this tonal struggle and we don't have the PG-13 versus R struggle, and it's a tonally consistent movie, even if that tone is over-the-top camp. And it embraces this all the way, unlike another recent movie. All of this allows for much better direction for the series. And, well, yes, maybe I would have rather seen the Venom property taken in a more gritty and serious direction after seeing the first one and seeing a more psychological type thriller. I'm very glad that they have decided on a tone for this movie. And this is also a tone that we haven't really seen before in a mainstream superhero film. It's something kind of new, which is nice. But beyond that, I read this movie as a satire on the MCU, on the entire idea of franchising comic book movies. And it's very easy to see this film as a satire if you view it that way. If you see this camp as something embraced to, I guess, reflect like the cheesiness of those 90s comic books, the cheesiness of the very ideas of this film. And so I read this embrace of camp as kind of a self-aware comment on just the absurdity in general of what comic books are and what Marvel in particular is, and what people are maybe forgetting about these movies is that they're based on incredibly cheesy source material and ideas that are just absurd. So this movie does remind us of that. It reminds us that, especially the Spider-Man property that's such a hot topic right now, it reminds us how cheesy and how terrible these ideas really are. And I really love this movie for that, because it allowed us to take a bigger look at the MCU as this thing that's like, yes, don't take these too seriously. Like, almost a direct reaction to a lot of people's views on Venom 1. Don't take these too seriously. These do not have to be serious movies. If anything, they shouldn't be. They should be goofball comedies like this one, because that's where all of this is coming from. It's coming from comic books. It's coming from stories about a guy getting bit by a spider and now he can climb up walls. So what it's really saying is, don't take this movie too seriously, and don't take any of this Marvel superhero stuff too seriously. It's just for fun. And so, intentional or not, I think the fact that this movie is so hilariously bad lends itself really well to self-satire. And that was really refreshing to see, especially right now with all of this hype around Spider-Man. But I do really think that this movie intended to be this kind of satire on the genre, because it does some things that retrospectively don't make a whole lot of sense. It sets up a villain that it knows is never really going to happen. And so that seems more to me like something they would do as a comment on the idea of setting stuff up, rather than something they actually wanted to set up. But as a movie itself, this movie is, wow, it is not a very good movie. It is, as I said, it is hilariously bad. This is a great, so bad it's good movie if you view it as just a superhero film, just a sequel to Venom. It's wild to think that this is a sequel to Venom. It does not feel like it. There are some moments of touching, actual funny moments, especially with Tom Hardy again reprising his role as Venom and as Eddie Brock. The interplay between them is even better in this movie, even more goofy and just even more out there. And it seems like he understands the character even more this time, and it's hilarious. The dynamic they have in this movie is funny even in concept. But there are some things that are really bad in this movie too. And one of them is the pacing of Act 1. Oh my god. Okay, so this has the opposite problem that the first movie had, where instead of setting everything up twice and taking forever to get going, this movie is like, we're going right now. As soon as this picture is on the screen, you're in the story, and it's just moving and going and going and going, and everything just, it sets up everything so fast. And I think that could be the result of this being 90 minutes long, and perhaps studio mandated 90 minutes. But I think it could also be part of that commentary on superhero movies, on the idea of quick setups to get to the goofy bathos comedy moments and to the big CGI thrills. But yeah, the pacing of the beginning of this movie is intense, and I don't know if it works that well. But by far, I think the worst part of this movie is undeniably Woody Harrelson as Cletus Cassidy. I don't know what this performance is. I don't understand it. Like, what is he doing? Like, he has this whole voice, his look. Like, look at his face on the poster. First of all, who chose this photo for the poster? And then second of all, I can't even put it into words. But Woody's performance is, I don't know what he was going for. I don't know what exactly this is supposed to be. I don't know whether this was intentional or not, because he is a good actor, and he can do a performance of a serial killer very well, as we saw in Natural Born Killers. And this is just not it. As I said, this movie is great as a so bad it's good movie, and Woody's performance is a huge part of that, I think. But if you're looking at this as a serious, like an actual serious movie, this performance totally missed the mark. And there were a couple of other performances that missed the mark as well. The cop, I don't know. It's weird to see so many performances that kind of just miss the mark, and Woody's missed the mark in a big way. But I don't know. It's hard to tell what the intention was in this movie. There are also a lot of flashbacks in this movie to stuff that happened in this movie, like 30 minutes ago in the runtime, that are just ridiculously unnecessary. and I'm not sure what the idea was behind putting these flashbacks in the movie when they're really, really unnecessary. I guess you're expecting your audience to just not pay any attention to what's happening, and so you need this? But I guess that's a fair point in this movie, because this is a hard movie to watch. But one of the biggest problems I had with this movie is that by turning this into a satire and turning this into whatever it is, it tossed out a lot of the world building that was done in the first film. And as I mentioned in my review of the first film, that movie set up a lot of stuff. Its world is immense and its character relations are complicated, just because we had so much time to establish all that stuff. And this movie tosses out a lot of those dynamics as jokes or just doesn't acknowledge them at all. And so a lot of that potential from the first one that was such a big missed opportunity is still not acted on in this one, because instead it's thrown out to have this movie be this kind of goofball comedy. But despite, again, kind of wasting a lot of the potential of this story, I think what Venom 2 did with its world and with its characters and with the Venom property is really cool. And I think this movie is worth seeing, maybe as a so bad it's good movie, maybe as a satire on the MCU, or maybe as just a display of how far a property can be pushed from what you might expect it to be. But I don't think this movie works completely well as a sequel to Venom, or really as a movie in itself. It works better as kind of an object of study, I guess. So I'm going to give Venom 2 a 6.5 out of 10, which is 1 point more than I gave Venom 1. Yeah, so overall, I thought Venom 2 was better than Venom 1. It was a lot more consistent. It was maybe not consistent in the way I was hoping it was going to be going in, but it was a fun movie, and it's a fun experience. Where the first one is just, it's kind of a trudge to get through, and it's really hard for me to watch that first movie without thinking about what it could have been. And the second film, yes, a little bit, but it's just so out there and so exaggerated and crazy that it's a lot easier to just view it as this absolute atrocity of hilariousness. So I think Venom 2 is better. Plus, it has better subtext. Maybe. I am now going to talk briefly about the ending of Venom 2, so spoilers, do be warned. So one of the biggest points of conversation about Venom 2 is its contribution to a larger universe. And that part of the movie was super cool to see, and it's going to be very interesting to see the interplay between the characters of this franchise and the other franchises. But this does contradict the idea of this movie as satire a little bit, because it now exists itself as part of what it's critiquing. And so it's a little bit self-critical now. So it definitely complicates things. But it makes the movie make a lot of sense in why it did what it did and why it used its characters so liberally. Because it seems to me, at least, that the Venom universe is kind of coming to a close. And so they're going to go all out. And that's, like I was saying earlier with the tease of the toxin villain for the supposed Venom 3, is that even going to happen? Because is that even the universe of these films anymore? It doesn't seem like it. So, I don't know. It makes a lot of sense, looking at it in that perspective. It makes a lot of sense that they were so liberal in their use of the characters, with it maybe being thrown away in the end, with the whole world maybe being thrown away in the end. But that was one of my biggest takeaways of my second viewing. So just want to add that on there. Anyways, guys, if you did enjoy it, please drop a like on the video and subscribe as not to miss any new and exciting film videos in the near future. And that just about does it. I've been Max. This has been Maxify Film Review, and I'll see you in the next one.